If there's one thing the last couple of years have really served to highlight, it's that peace can be incredibly fragile, with the recent escalation between two nuclear-armed states, India and Pakistan, serving as the most recent example. On the 22nd of April, gunmen murdered 26 civilians in Indian-administered Kashmir. The Pakistani government asserted that it wasn't involved, but India claimed the attacks were linked to a militant group with bases in Pakistani-controlled territory, and on the 7th of May, launched a series of strikes across the border and line of control. The Pakistani military responded, and the situation escalated. We saw an escalation cycle that reportedly included cross-border shell fire, air and missile attacks, drone strikes, as well as claimed aircraft shoot-downs. And much of the world is now nervously waiting to see whether an announced ceasefire will ultimately hold. This video isn't about those events. As it stands, the fog of war is thick, the information space is a disinformation-filled swamp, and while I think there have been some serious verifiable developments, I'd rather try and get the news right than get it done quick. And so it's probably going to be days or weeks before I think we can confidently tell the story of what we've seen so far. Instead, what I want to do is talk about one of the two main parties to this conflict. More than a year ago, I did a video on India and its military, and so today it's time to talk about their longtime neighbour and rival, the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. Trying to set out from a military and defence economic position, not just the military balance as it currently stands between the two states, but also the way that balance has evolved, the immense challenges of the Pakistani position, and what that might mean for future strategic stability, almost no matter how the current crisis ends. To that end, I'll start with the basics. A very brief look at recent events, and then a dive into Pakistan's geography, strategic position, and what we know or can surmise about its strategic objectives and doctrine. Then we'll work through Pakistan's present-day military forces, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, its nuclear capabilities, and importantly, how those measure up against India and what that means for escalation management. Then we'll turn the defence economics lens on the problem and try and project forward, asking why the Pakistani strategic position from a military balance perspective is so difficult to maintain, why there are reasons to believe it might degrade further in the future, and what challenges that might potentially pose for Pakistan, the region, and for global peace and stability. But before we jump into the study, let me first welcome back a sponsor. In 2025, it can sometimes feel like world-changing events have become a frighteningly regular occurrence. And so if you're trying to stay across all of those stories and different angles on them, you might want a tool to help. As we click through these headlines on Russia's proposal for a short truce to cover their May 9 parade, you'll instantly see the difference in what different sources choose to elevate to the headline. This one only mentions Ukraine knocking back the 3-day truce offer. But if you click over to this one, you'll see the extra context that Ukraine is actually proposing a much longer ceasefire that could potentially actually enable negotiations to take place. The tool being used here is Ground News. By reportedly drawing on more than 50,000 news sources around the world, what it can potentially allow you to do is quickly compare how a given story is being covered, as well as some of the context around that coverage. Think ownership information or factuality ratings reportedly based on the work of 3 independent news monitoring organisations. And beyond that, as a long-time user, I'm also a fan of some of Ground News' additional features. My favourite, as I previously mentioned, has long been the blind spot feed. To oversimplify, what it can allow you to do is essentially surface stories that are overwhelmingly being covered by the kind of sources that you yourself might not ordinarily consume. You may not think they're very good sources, and potentially with good reason. But in this era of online echo chambers, I think it can be useful to see what others might be seeing and reading. So if you're interested in trying Ground News, there will be a link in the description. That'll give you access to a 40% discount on their Vantage plan, which is the one I use. And so with my thanks to Ground News, this channel's longest running sponsor, let's get back to it. Okay, so as with all of these nation studies, let's start at a relatively high level. Welcome to Pakistan. As of 2024, this was a developing, lower middle income economy with a population of approximately 254 million. Nominal GDP that year was approximately $375 billion US, but in purchasing parity terms, closer to 1.5 trillion. In strategic terms, of course, comparisons often matter as much or more than absolutes. And in that respect, Pakistan has the strategic challenge of being a relatively large, relatively populous country by global standards, but also having as its primary strategic rival a much larger and even more populous one. In population terms, India is between 5.5 and 6 times larger than Pakistan, and its economy in nominal US dollar terms is more than 10 times larger. And while, as we'll see a little bit later, the gap in terms of major military resources like nuclear warheads, active duty personnel, or major military platforms isn't as wide as it is with the economy or population counts, right out of the gate, it arguably represents something of a strategic handicap for Islamabad. To give you a sense of scale, those economic and population ratios aren't entirely dissimilar from what we saw between Russia and Ukraine before the invasion in 2022. And unlike Ukraine, Pakistan obviously has access to significant balancing military resources. like a much larger air force and nuclear weapons. Yes, there is clearly a resource disadvantage here compared to India, but not so far a strategically decisive one. So many elements of Pakistan's current geography, demography, and strategic position go back to the legacy of partition. At a very high level, Pakistan incorporated most of the Muslim-majority states, but it was far from a clean process. The Great Migrations and non-YouTube friendly events of the partition era drove immense human casualties and suffering, and that process, as well as the that followed, created a number of territorial and strategic flashpoints. Originally, for example, Pakistan was composed of two geographically separated parts, West and East Pakistan. But as we'll cover a bit more later on, East Pakistan would break away and become Bangladesh in 1971. Other Cold War flashpoints, however, very much persist to the current day. At the heart of that is the territory of what was once the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir. Given the intricacies of this place, I think there's really only two good ways for foreign online commentators to talk about its history: comprehensively, accurately, and carefully, or not at all. And so in the interest of time, rather than describing how we got here, I'm going to describe the situation as we see it today. India claims everything within the old princely state's borders. India administers the largest share of the territory in its population, Pakistan the majority of the rest, with a set line of control dividing the two. Do note though, when I say line of control, that's not a case of either side accepting the other's territorial claims. It's just an agreement to disagree over the ownership and not to push their military forces across that line. Finally, because two-way nuclear standoffs are apparently common enough, in Kashmir we get a three-way, with the People's Republic of China administering part of the old princely state territory, and they and India having fought and skirmished over that line of actual control multiple times. So yeah, overlapping territorial claims, three nuclear powers, and extremely difficult terrain. What could possibly go wrong? Then, if you're looking for more reasons to describe the Pakistani situation as strategic hard mode, it's worth considering the issue of strategic depth in an era of long-range weapons. Pakistan is not a small country, but its capital and some of its major cities are positioned relatively close to the line where Pakistan stops and India begins, where an opponent with even relatively basic levels of military technology is going to be able to reach out for the major population and economic centres. Islamabad, the capital, and two of the three largest cities, Karachi and Hyderabad, are within 200 kilometres of the de facto or legal border, putting them well within the range of TBMs or a variety of air-launched munitions. Lahore, meanwhile, with its 14 million people, gets the full Kharkiv or Seoul-style experience, being so close to the Indian border that most MRLs or long-range cannon artillery systems could make the shot. All of that means that a lot of key Pakistani targets are always going to be within opposing threat range, and in a war, the country could never afford to lose that much territory without forfeiting some very painful objectives. In terms of natural resources, Pakistan's situation is a bit of a mixed bag with some key vulnerabilities. The country does have some major natural resource deposits, everything from coal to rare earth metals to oil and gas. But having deposits isn't the same as having developed and easily recoverable deposits, and Pakistan has historically faced challenges on both fronts. Security has sometimes been seen as a major barrier to investment, as in March last year when 5 Chinese engineers were killed after a vehicle rigged with explosives rammed into a bus transporting them on the way to a dam project. For those and other reasons then, Pakistan is highly reliant on energy imports. One of the most acute resource risks for Pakistan, however, is actually water. A lot of Pakistan's territory is alluvial plain. It's very fertile and suitable for agriculture, but with not much rainfall of its own. And with 250 million mouths to feed, there's a lot of pressure on that land to maintain agricultural output. As Daniel Haynes, an associate professor at the University College of London, put it, the ambition to increase the acreage of farmland has outstripped the amount of water that was available. End quote. And Pakistan is generally recognised as being one of the most water-stressed countries on planet Earth. The country has suffered devastating floods, but also painful droughts. And the twist that brings in the element of strategic vulnerability is that a lot of the water that Pakistan does have comes from India. One source I found suggests that around 80% of Pakistan's agriculture and a third of its hydroelectric power depends on water from the Indus Basin. By treaty going back to the 1960s, Pakistan and India split those water resources. But in practical terms, it's India that controls the sources, the upriver positions, meaning that unless we experience some kind of localised gravity inversion, it's India that gets to influence the flows into Pakistan, not vice versa. In a sense, it's an interesting inversion of the relationship we see between India and China when it comes to water resources. With Pakistan, though, it's India in the Obi-Wan position. And in the context of the current crisis, we've already seen India hint at playing that card, officially suspending that 65-year-old water-sharing treaty and saying they'd stop water flowing across international borders. In practical terms, India in the here and now doesn't actually have the ability to stop those flows. We are talking about an absolute shit ton of water, and India does not have the dams or the reservoirs to hold it back forever. But they can do all kinds of things to influence the flow, make Pakistan's life more difficult, and divert more of that water away for Indian use. In the longer term, if more dams and reservoirs are constructed, India's ability to influence this vital input into Pakistan's agriculture and to Pakistan's energy generation will only increase. So you have a very long border with active territorial disputes, limited strategic depth around some of the major cities, and significant resource vulnerabilities, with the major party controlling one of those resource vulnerabilities also being your primary strategic competitor. As you can see, we're off to a strong start here. A nation's strategic position, though, isn't just determined by its resources or its geography, it's also about its allies and partners. And here, Pakistan's position has changed significantly over time. For much of the Cold War, for example, Pakistan had a relatively close relationship with the United States and also the People's Republic of China. From the point of view of Washington and Beijing, Pakistan was sometimes seen as a useful counterbalance to a Soviet Union-backed India. And then a bit of a Korean War reprise, the Air War in 1971 saw American-built Sabres and F-104s being flown by Pakistan against MiG-21s being flown by the Indian Air Force. The peaks of American military support for Pakistan, however, have tended to coincide not so much with tensions with India, but increased American interests in Afghanistan. The chart you can see on screen here shows American arms exports to Pakistan in CIPRI TOV terms for 5-year periods going all the way back to 1970. What you can see are two very clear peaks, 1980 to 1989, and the 2005 through 2014 period. Notably, as you can see here though, that 2010 to 2014 period was really mostly just 2010, with a significant drop-off in 2012, 13 and 14. The key point here is that American support, particularly military support for Islamabad, hasn't been an even feature. It's been subject to moments where interests coincide, and also significant inflection points. After the Soviet Union pulled out of Afghanistan in 1989, as a complete coincidence, US arms shipments to Pakistan fell off a cliff. And as the US position during their own war in Afghanistan and their relationship to Pakistan shifted over time, so too did the level of arms shipments and supports. Over the last several decades then, what we've seen from Islamabad is a shift in their primary strategic partners, both in terms of economic investment and also in terms of arms supplies and security. In the late 90s, the People's Republic of China accounted for about 20% of arms exports to Pakistan. European states, particularly Ukraine, a weird example we'll get to later, made up a vast majority of the rest. From 2005 to 2009, when the NATO presence in Afghanistan was very much a going concern, France, the United States and Italy accounted for a narrowly larger but still larger share of total flows compared to China. Over the last 5 years though, shipments from the United States and European Union have basically collapsed. And China now accounts for more than 4/5 of all of Pakistan's arms imports. I think that then suggests that while in 2025 Pakistan does have some strong international relationships with Turkey, for example, from a strategic perspective, the country's primary security partner is now very clearly China, with all of the implications that has for the country's strategic position, its relationship with India, and the technology that its armed forces have access to. If that's the strategic overview, then let's talk about stated objectives. What Pakistan might reasonably expect its military to do or be capable of doing. In the early days, Pakistan's national security framework, such as it was relatively simple. All eyes were pretty squarely set on India. In more recent years, however, we've seen Pakistan move towards a much broader assessment. Since the early 2010s, the country has used its so-called threat matrix to assess both conventional and sub-conventional threats. And working from statements by various Pakistani military leaders, Pakistani political leaders, and some of the documents and strategies we have seen the government release, a highlight reel, if you like, of national strategic imperatives would probably go something like this. The Pakistani military needs to be able to maintain the conventional and nuclear balance against India, deter any changes to the territorial status quo, deal with sub-conventional and internal threats, including in the northwest of the country, police and maintain control of the country's maritime exclusive economic zone, and assist in defending against other non-kinetic threats like cyber warfare and economic coercion. A point that I think needs to be made when understanding the imperatives of the Pakistani military, however, is that I think it would be wrong to think of it as just a simple extension of the will of the state. I think some commentators occasionally make the error of assuming that all militaries and all military leaders are just bound by the cold, hard strategic logic of state interest. In reality, militaries are institutions. Institutions are made up of people. And people and institutions can have their own interests, sometimes entirely distinct from those of the nation state. Not all militaries are equally autonomous or equally politically active, of course. But over the course of the country's history, The Pakistani military has been a very politically active one, with no shortage of either military coups or periods of military and military-backed rule. For the first couple of years after independence, the Pakistani military was still commanded by British officers. And seeing as Britain was in the process of trying to disentangle itself from its old colonial holdings, there were no military coups in the late 40s or early 50s. In January 1951, though, General Sir Douglas Gracey handed over to General Ayub Khan, the first native Pakistani to hold the position of Commander-in-Chief of the Pakistani military, and by 1958, the first Pakistani commander of the country's military had become the country's second president. He would rule the country until he resigned in March 1969. Next came another head of the country's military, Yahya Khan, a man who was quoted as saying of his mandate to rule in an article in 1971 that, quote, "The people did not bring me to power, I came myself," and of Pakistan's struggling economy at the time, quote, "I inherited a bad economy and I'm going to pass it on," end quote. After a political party in East Pakistan, the Awami League, won so many seats in the 1970 election that they'd have a majority in the Pakistani legislature as a whole, Khan and his government eventually opted for a military crackdown instead. If you do search the term Operation Searchlight, be prepared for some pretty confronting reading. But the crux of it is that the troops went in, leading to the 1971 war that, following Indian intervention, became a complete disaster for Pakistan. Bangladesh became an independent state, and Pakistani casualties killed, wounded and taken prisoner crossed the 100,000 mark. Khan was then toppled by elements of the military in December 1971. A brief period of civilian rule followed until the military apparently decided that was enough experimenting with that, and in 1977 it was time for another military coup. General Zia, Chief of the Army Staff, overthrew President Bhutto, declared martial law, suspended the constitution, and would then rule as the country's president until 1988. Another brief period of civilian rule, and then another military coup in 1999. President Nawaz Sharif announced that he was replacing the Chief of the Army Staff and the country's Defence Minister, Pervez Musharraf, who decided to respond to his firing by playing the Uno reverse card. And since "I'm the one with all the guns" is a pretty persuasive argument, Sharif was replaced instead. I could go on and discuss more recent events, but by now you probably get the point. The issue I'm trying to get to isn't so much the performance or outcomes of any of Pakistan's previous political leaders, it's the fact that the military in the country is not just the armed extension of the state, it's a major political actor in the state. Something important to keep in mind as we go through the rest of this and potentially other videos. That said, let's get into looking at Pakistani military forces as they currently stand. And here we'll start with the largest of the three main Pakistani services, which is of course the Pakistani Army. According to Military Balance 2024, which we use as a source across these videos to maintain consistency between countries, the Army had about 560,000 active personnel in 2024. At a headline level, that was supported by a pretty significant equipment park, more than 2,500 tanks, 3,500 APCs, 550 self-propelled guns, and 1,600 towed artillery pieces, as well as multiple rocket launchers, air defence systems, short-range ballistic missiles, etc. If you start digging a little deeper into those figures though, a couple of things immediately stand out. For one, you can immediately see the country's changing political relationships over time reflected in a very, very diverse equipment park. The attack helicopters are mostly American Cobras. More than 2,000 of the APCs are American M113s. Quite a few of the short-range air defence systems are French, and the main battle tanks, a mixture of Ukrainian, Chinese, and then a number of Pakistani or jointly developed upgrade packages, designs and derivatives. That diversity and the long timelines over which all of this stuff was accumulated helps contribute to a couple of oddities. Ask whether the country's big guns use NATO or Soviet-style ammunition, for example, and the answer is obviously yes. With the country's army using American 8-inch, NATO 155, Soviet 130, Soviet 122, NATO 105, Soviet 85, Soviet 57, 40mm, 37mm and 35mm between its artillery and anti-aircraft artillery pieces. That diversity is again driven both by sourcing. Most of the self-propelled guns, for example, are American designs, while most of the towed artillery are Chinese versions of Soviet systems, and also just by age. 85mm, for example, is on the list because the country on paper still has about 300 Type 72 85mm anti-aircraft guns. The Chinese designation for what is basically the Soviet M1939, a gun which went out of Soviet production in 1945. The point here is threefold. A, generally this is not a military that throws anything away. B, it's a country with an interesting mix of material, including those Ukrainian T-80UDs I mentioned earlier. And C, the country's primary ammunition producer, Pakistan Ordnance Factories, necessarily have a bit more of a diverse ammunition offering than a lot of other producers, something which might help explain why we've seen Pakistani ordnance appear in Ukrainian hands. While there is a significant amount of older equipment in the lineup though, the Pakistani army absolutely has some sharp edges. It possesses a guided 300mm multiple rocket launch system, the A-100, reportedly capable of flinging a heavy guided projectile more than 100 kilometres. The army also has a range of short and medium-range ballistic missiles across the conventional and nuclear missions. Some of these are comparatively older and less capable. The early 1990s-era short-range missiles, for example, are assessed by the CSAS to have a circular error probable measured in kilometres, but several more recent designs are believed to be both considerably more accurate and longer-ranged. This is where I think the biggest point of uncertainty rests when it comes to the Pakistani army, the actual scale of its missile park. As for the 7.5-metre-long Fatah-2, it's generally accepted the system can hurl a 365-kilogram warhead several hundred kilometres with a combined INS-GNS guidance package. But ask exactly how many of the things Pakistan has or how quickly they're producing them, and you might well end up with more questions than answers. The basic gist here is we know the Pakistani army has some relatively modern long-range strike systems capable of reaching into Indian rear areas. What we're not sure of is exactly how deep the stockpiles of those munitions, or ammunition in general, actually goes. That brings us to what is arguably, in a comparative sense, qualitatively the best of Pakistan's conventional forces, the Air Force. Pakistan's Air Force was originally reliant on British designs, but as the Cold War progressed, transitioned towards more American and Chinese designs. The Air Force also benefited from foreign advisors, as well as several opportunities to rack up combat experience. Famously, for example, American General Chuck Yeager, the first man to break the sound barrier, was assigned to Pakistan in the early 1970s as America's air attaché. There, he reportedly assisted with a number of interesting tasks you probably wouldn't see in the US Air Force proper, like overseeing the installation of AIM-9 sidewinders on Chinese-built Shenyang F-6 jets, but also combat tactics development, and he spoke quite positively about Pakistani Air Force performance during the 1971 war. Relative to the size of the Pakistani economy, the Air Force is relatively large, well-equipped, and of course diverse. The fleet's reported to have more than 400 fighters, with the main types being American F-16s, French Mirages, and Chinese light fighters, the JF-17. The older F-7s, essentially the Chinese license-built version of the old Soviet MiG-21, serve in more of a second-line role. In terms of air defence capabilities, the country's fighter force is also augmented by some longer-ranged air defence systems, including the Chinese HQ-9. That's a particularly long-ranged air defence system. The closest comparison would probably be something like the Soviet S-300, but with some technological differences under the hood. At a very high level then, when you're comparing the Pakistani Air Force to its Indian competitor, you're looking at a force of American, Chinese and older French aircraft and a Chinese version of a Russian air defence system, up against a force primarily using Russian and French aircraft and a Russian-built air defence system. Before we discuss quality, if we just take a look at the quantitative side of an equation, you can see signs of the priority that Pakistan attaches to the Air Force coming through. If you look at just land-based air superiority and multi-role fighters, India does have an airframe advantage, but not a particularly large one. Somewhere between very roughly 1.25 and 1.6 to 1, depending on things like whether or not you count India's attack aircraft, its Jaguars in the mix. That's already not a massive quantitative advantage if you're contemplating a potential offensive air campaign, especially once you take into account the home field advantage and the issue of force dispersion. At any given time, a vast majority of Pakistan's fighters are going to be positioned with India as the potential opponent in mind. You would imagine that all else being equal, operating from permanent prepared bases within range of the border, the share of Pakistan's air assets that might be able to contribute to a potential air engagement is at any given time going to be comparatively high. By contrast, the Indian Air Force is much more dispersed. Geographically, India is a much larger country, there's a lot more airspace to police, and there are also potential competitors to posture against, for example, the People's Liberation Army Air Force. That leads to situations where some of the Indian Air Force's best assets might not be immediately available in the case of an escalation with Pakistan, like the one we've recently seen. 101 Squadron, the Falcons for example, one of the Indian Air Force's Rafale squadrons, is reportedly based at Hasimira Air Force Station in West Bengal, more than 1,500 kilometres from the line of control in Kashmir. What that means is that while we can confidently say the Pakistani Air Force doesn't have as many fighters as its Indian competitor, what the balance of available resources is locally in the event of this kind of escalation isn't necessarily anywhere near as clear. And if we turn our attention to the qualitative side of things, while like the Army, the quality of the Pakistani Air Force's fleet is variable squadron to squadron, there are absolutely a couple of sharp technological edges. In their case, I'd argue the combination of a couple of different systems working together. While the most common Chinese fighters in Pakistani service are the older F-7s or the light JF-17s, there is one squadron of the larger, heavier J-10C, complete with an AESA radar and the export version of China's long-range PL-15 air-to-air missile. We've talked about the range, performance and significance of that missile in the past, and the general assessment that at least the Chinese version of that missile enjoys a range advantage over the American AMRAAM. So you have a small number of very capable fighters, a long-range air-to-air missile, and supporting them, a reasonable inventory of enablers. In numerical terms, Pakistan actually operates a larger AWACS fleet than India does, and the backbone of that system is the relatively modern Saab 2000 that the country first started receiving in 2011. What that means is that even compared to a number of Western militaries, the Pakistani Air Force has a number of very modern tools to surveil its airspace, control its aircraft, and potentially provide the sensor coverage to get as much as possible out of its longer-ranged air-to-air missiles. As I said right at the start, there's still a bunch of competing claims and uncertainty going around about potential aircraft shoot-downs in the last couple of days. And while I don't yet want to speculate on what aircraft or how many may actually have been brought down, if there were any IAF aircraft shot down, especially more capable ones like Rafale, my number one suspect, based just on technical capabilities alone, would be the combination of something carrying a PL-15 and a sensor system strong enough to take advantage of it, whether that be AWACS or an onboard AESA radar. Given the stock price for Chengdu Aircraft Corporation is up more than 30% over the last 5 days, I imagine that might be what the market believes as well, but I suspect it's going to be a little while yet before we can say anything definitively. For now, I think it's fair to say that of the traditional domains, the air is where the quantitative and qualitative balance is least slanted against Pakistan. It has a large number of fourth-generation airframes, some capable munitions, and a large pool of enablers, all of which might provide a significant challenge even to a numerically superior Indian Air Force, especially if the Pakistanis were fighting on home turf. The same probably can't be said for the Pakistani Navy. That's not to say the Pakistani Navy is a small force. Including the Marines, it's about 30,000 active duty personnel, with a fleet of 5 conventional attack submarines, 10 principal surface combatants, and a number of smaller vessels. The attack submarine force is made up of 5 derivatives of different versions of the French Augusta class. The 2 older boats, the Hashmat class, are derivatives of the Augusta 70, and the 3 more modern Halids, 2 of which are fitted with air-independent propulsion systems, are derivatives of the Augusta 90B. In practical terms, these submarines are comparatively small. The largest member of the class displaces about 2,000 tonnes submerged, and despite modernisation efforts, also comparatively old. The 2 Hashmats were originally completed in 1979 and 1980 respectively, meaning they're pushing ever closer to 50 years in service. The 2 newest versions, however, that were actually assembled in Pakistan were completed in 2002 and 2006 respectively, and as such have a little bit more bling to show for it. Ironically, a significant part of India's attack boat fleet is also French, albeit in that case, derivatives of a much more recent design. India also has its 4 derivatives of the German Type 209 U-boats, and its 7 improved Kilo-class boats, giving India a solid quantitative and qualitative advantage when it comes to underwater warfare. While the Pakistani submarine fleet has a lot of French DNA, the surface fleet is for the most part made in China. There's one ex-American Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigate, but the core of the surface combat fleet are 8 Chinese frigates. Perhaps the most formidable ships in the lineup are 4 derivatives of the Chinese Type 54. Those come with an AESA radar, 4 anti-ship missiles, and a 32-cell VLS. The first of those ships entered service in 2021, and for a country like Pakistan, represent modern, capable surface combatants. The challenge for the Pakistani Navy, then, is more of a comparative one. India's principal surface combatant fleet is, in numerical terms, very roughly 3 times larger, on average displaces more per ship, and includes some platforms where Pakistan doesn't have any direct equivalent. Indian naval task forces, for example, can take air cover with them, courtesy of the country's 2 aircraft carriers. But Pakistan's vessels are reliant on their own anti-aircraft defences, and whatever air cover the Pakistani Air Force flying from Pakistan itself can potentially provide. If the goal is simply patrolling and exercising control within the country's exclusive economic zone, that might be sufficient. But in a larger conflict, it would significantly limit the ability of the fleet to project power further abroad. There have been ambitious plans announced to scale up Pakistan's navy. In 2020, Pakistan's then outgoing Navy chief discussed plans to expand the Navy to more than 50 warships, double the number of major surface combatants to 20, and introduce a range of new platforms and weapon systems. And while some elements of that rather ambitious expansion plan are still uncertain, there are some significant components that already appear to be in progress. As far back as 2015, for example, Pakistan initiated a program for 8 new submarines with the People's Republic of China, And a number of new or modernised surface warships, primarily derived either from Turkish or Chinese designs, are expected before the end of the decade. If those programs remain on track and the funding continues to be available, they may somewhat narrow the disparity in hulls and tonnage between Pakistan and the Indian Navy, although the extent to which they're able to do so may also come down to the way India's own modernisation and expansion plans play out. We could dig more into the list of equipment and what that means from an industrial and logistics standpoint, but the broad takeaway here when it comes to conventional weapon systems and combat power has to be comparative. By global standards, Pakistan has a large military and is especially capable in the air. But especially if you leave the air forces aside for a moment, where the contest is quantitatively and qualitatively a bit closer, the conventional balance between Islamabad and New Delhi is very much not in Pakistan's favour. And that's not just me making that determination, it's something Pakistani military leaders themselves have said. And it also explains why there's a fourth element to Pakistani force structure that we need to discuss. Because as retired Pakistani General Khalid Kidwai said in 2015, quote, "Notwithstanding the growing conventional asymmetries, the development and possession of sufficient numbers and varieties of nuclear weapons by both India and Pakistan has made war as an instrument of policy near redundant. The tried and tested concept of MAD has ensured that." End quote. And so I think we need to talk about Pakistan's nuclear weapons, its nuclear doctrine, and how they fit into this overall strategic picture. Pakistan's ambitions to obtain nuclear weapons go back more than half a century. In the 1970s, a time when Pakistan was still a country of very limited economic resources, President Bhutto reportedly said of the atomic bomb, quote, "We will eat grass, even go hungry, but we will get one of our own. We have no other choice." End quote. Despite that stated determination, and India setting off its first nuclear detonation in 1974, Pakistan's first and so far only public nuclear tests wouldn't take place until the late 1990s. In May 1998, Pakistan became the seventh country to publicly test nuclear weapons with a series of 6 detonations. The country subsequently put in place a nuclear testing moratorium, even though it remains outside the Non-Proliferation Treaty framework, and hasn't publicly tested another device since. In 2023, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist estimated the country had about 162 nuclear warheads, split between 36 intended for air delivery by the country's Mirage jets, and 126 across Pakistan's various missile systems. They also assessed that there was a small number of warheads not directly linked to a delivery system, for a total warhead count of approximately 170. Some more recent estimates put the warhead count closer to 170. One thing that stands out compared to other nuclear arsenals, though, is while the Pakistani weapons are still believed to be obviously terrifying and capable of great devastation, the yields are comparatively low. Pakistan has never publicly tested a hydrogen bomb, and the yields for most of their available warheads are believed to be in the single-digit or low double-digit kiloton range. Still obviously incredibly dangerous if they hit a military or civilian target. If it hits you or near you, 10,000 tonnes of TNT equivalent is the kind of thing that you're going to notice. But by global standards, that's a very restrained yield level. Taking the higher end estimates from the table there generates a total of about 3.3 to 3.4 megatons equivalent across all of the warheads. A single American Trident missile with a full load of 8 W-88 warheads gives you a number close to 3.8 megatons. In other words, this is a serious nuclear arsenal because all nuclear arsenals are serious. But it's also not an end human civilization as we know it kind of nuclear arsenal. You'll probably also notice that a lot of these systems have relatively limited ranges and thus are probably more relevant for non-strategic or battlefield uses as opposed to counter-value attacks against Indian cities or population centres. Compare that to a more predominantly counter-value focused force and you might get some clues as to Pakistan's nuclear doctrine and its approach to nuclear weapons more broadly. Pakistan hasn't released a full public nuclear doctrine, and there's also good reason to believe that what doctrine does exist has changed significantly over time. That said, based on the work of various analysts and what we've heard from Pakistani officials, there are a couple of constants or things we can say relatively confidently about Pakistan and its nukes. It's generally assessed that a key policy goal of Pakistan's nuclear weapons is to deter Indian conventional as well as nuclear attack, and in the event that deterrence fails, to deny India a victory. Note, that characterisation is generally but not uniformly accepted. General Mahmoud Durrani, for example, contended that Pakistan's nuclear weapons program was only conceived to neutralise a nuclear threat from India, not to correct the conventional imbalance. But I do think a preponderance of the evidence points in the direction of Pakistan considering nuclear weapons as a valid counterbalance to Indian conventional superiority. To that end, it's also clear that Pakistan has never publicly put forward a no first use doctrine, and as one source put it, quote, "There's a broad consensus in both the academic and policy communities in favour of retaining the first use option," end quote. If the concern here is Indian conventional military superiority, then to an extent, reserving the right to first use makes sense. If India has the more powerful conventional military, it's unlikely they'd ever be pushed into a position of having to make a choice between using nuclear weapons or losing. Meaning, some Pakistani sources would argue that India has the strategic luxury of reserving its nuclear weapons for retaliatory use only. Pakistan, by contrast, might perceive a need to rely on those nuclear weapons to offset that Indian military advantage. Another element was the testing moratorium, which both Pakistan and India currently maintain, and also the approach, very different from that of the United States or some other nuclear powers like the United Kingdom, of keeping the vast majority of their warheads not mated to the final delivery system. That control, that practice of keeping warhead and delivery systems separate, has arguably played a crisis management role. If you have a bunch of very low warning delivery systems, like aircraft based close to your opponent or short-range ballistic missiles, and you say you're willing to use nuclear weapons in a first-use capacity, and you make the warheads to the missiles full-time, then your opponent, quite understandably, might be on a constant hair-trigger alert. Any sortie, any potential military manoeuvre, might be interpreted as the preparations for a surprise nuclear attack, and potentially invite miscalculation. Keeping warheads separate both has the advantage of greater security and also providing a clearer step for the escalation ladder. Your opponent can relax a bit more as long as your warheads remain in hardened storage, and they're very much put on notice the moment their intelligence spots you moving them. Another clue as to how Pakistan might potentially see the role of nuclear weapons comes in the types of nuclear weapon delivery system that it's chosen to develop. Remember, this is not a country drowning in resources. Missiles are expensive, and so everyone designed, tested and manufactured represents a significant commitment. And the inclusion of everything from short-range missiles in the 60 to 70 kilometre range bracket to a in-development sea-launched cruise missile suggests the desire for a graduated response, where Pakistani leadership might want the opportunity to introduce nuclear weapons into a crisis in a very limited way, while also having longer-range systems capable of hitting targets anywhere in India that pose that counter-value threat. As retired Pakistani General Kidwai put it, speaking in 2015, quote, Pakistan's full-spectrum deterrence capability, while remaining within the larger philosophy of credible minimum deterrence, comprises horizontally a robust tri-services inventory of a variety of nuclear weapons. Vertically, the spectrum encapsulates adequate range coverage from 0 metres to 2,750 kilometres, as well as nuclear weapons destructive yields that are at 3 tiers: strategic, operational, and tactical. Pakistan possesses an entire range of weapons yield coverage in terms of kilotons, and Pakistan retains the liberty of choosing from a full spectrum of targets in a target-rich India, notwithstanding the Indian indigenous ballistic missile defence capability, or the Russian S-400, to include counter-value, counter-force, and battlefield targets. End quote. To me, that suggests that Pakistan's nuclear targeting decisions could be basically anything Islamabad feels they need to be in order to meet their goals in any particular scenario. That said, I think it needs to be highlighted that there are arguments out there that relying on nuclear weapons to counterbalance an opponent's conventional superiority is a very dangerous game to play. For example, the nuclear taboo has proven to be pretty powerful for more than 3/4 of a century at this point. There is a reason both Russia and the United States have lost wars in the past without resorting to the use of nuclear weapons. There's a reason Russia has not used nuclear weapons in Ukraine and is unlikely to do so in the future, despite the fact that in that case, unlike with Pakistan and India, its opponent doesn't even have nuclear weapons of its own, and so it doesn't face the prospect of nuclear retaliation. The reality is that the vast majority of the major powers out there have strong incentives to make sure nuclear non-use remains the norm, and so they also have strong incentives to retaliate harshly against any country that breaks from that norm. And so you can easily imagine scenarios where the conventional military situation might cause Pakistani commanders to wish they could turn to the tactical nuclear weapon solution, only for the strategic calculus to show that whatever battlefield advantage might be gained by using them would be more than lost in terms of diplomatic fallout and international consequences. This is part of the great paradox of nuclear weapons as strategic tools. There are particular use cases where they're arguably more powerful and more impactful than any other system that humanity has ever devised. If your goal is to prevent an opponent nuking your cities, for example, we haven't yet found a better solution than threatening to nuke theirs right back. But at lower rungs on the escalation ladder, things can get a little murky, and choosing to rely on nuclear weapons as an escalation management tool potentially carries risks all of its own, particularly when you take into account what we know or think we might know about Pakistan and India's approach to escalation. To demonstrate what I mean, let's simplify the scenario down a bit. Let's assume that India does have a significant advantage when it comes to conventional forces. Perhaps in response to that, Pakistan focuses a lot of energy and resources on 2 different non-conventional options. One is to go even higher on the escalation ladder, that is, use nuclear weapons, and the other is actually lower down, the use of unconventional tactics, grey zone warfare, the support of proxies, etc. That leaves us with this escalation ladder with different rough advantages at different levels. What you then potentially see next is both sides adopting options to try and force the other side not to operate on the section of the escalation ladder where they have the advantage. If Pakistan employs unconventional warfare, say supporting separatists or sponsoring an attack in India proper, then without equivalent asymmetric capabilities, India's policy becomes to retaliate to unconventional warfare using conventional forces. For example, say launching air and missile attacks against targets in territory controlled by Pakistan. At that stage, the next layer of Pakistani policy kicks in. It's been widely reported that Islamabad's policy on Indian conventional action is quid pro quo plus, suggesting that any Indian action should be retaliated against in kind with a small escalation. The idea there may be to try and deter India from taking a conventional action for fear of Pakistan hitting back just that bit harder. The problem, however, as we established, is that India's resources on the conventional level of this ladder run much deeper than Pakistan's. So if at every stage India takes an action, Pakistan escalates on that action, India responds in kind, causing Pakistan to escalate, eventually it's Pakistan that's going to run out of conventional ladder first, forcing them eventually to make a decision, de-escalate, or potentially move up to the limited use of nuclear force. Indian policy, however, foresees that and doesn't want to see a nuclear escalation, and so has adopted a policy of massive retaliation, where any nuclear use by an opponent, including limited nuclear use, will result in massive nuclear use to try and knock out all of an opponent's military capacity. At that point, the winners or losers in the exchange become potentially academic. But short of that mutually destructive threshold, you can see why Pakistan would have an incentive to still maintain significant conventional capabilities. It gives them significantly more options, assists in deterrence, and takes the pressure off any potential decision to resort to nuclear first use. Regardless of the balance or situation, we've never yet seen an India-Pakistan crisis cross that nuclear threshold, and both countries have strong incentives to make sure it never does. More often than not, we've seen ceasefire agreements, sometimes with foreign involvement in brokering those agreements, rather than a conflict continuing to spiral out of control the way this sort of escalation ladder model might suggest they should. And so far, that appears to be the direction that the current crisis might also be following. At the same time, I'd be careful about assuming that will always automatically be the case. And from a Pakistani perspective, looking forward, I think there are some serious long-term challenges when it comes to trying to maintain the balance between Pakistan's capabilities and India's ones. You'll remember I said right at the start that if we were to assign geostrategic difficulty ratings to countries, Pakistan would probably deserve a hard. And I'd argue that comes down not to a single factor, but multiple ones coming together. Issue number one, and something deeply relevant to the discussion we just had about Pakistan's nuclear arsenal, is an issue I've heard described in a number of different ways: the challenge of strategic stability in a multipolar system. But in a simple sense, what we're really trying to say is the military balance isn't a simple two-player game between Islamabad and New Delhi. Strategic competition and the arms race goes much wider than that, meaning Pakistan might have much less control than they might like over the kind of factors that inform some of India's decisions around military build-up and escalation. The reason for that is that while Pakistan might be India's longest established strategic rival, it's not the only perceived strategic threat. India also has territorial disputes with China. India has also fought skirmishes and small wars with China. And Indian military planners, especially Indian nuclear military planners, when they're trying to determine what level of nuclear or conventional force is required to maintain deterrence, have to keep an eye not just on Islamabad, but also on Beijing. Because if that balance ever fell too far out of whack from an Indian perspective, at best, the country might lose some cards at the negotiating table. At worst, Beijing might decide to more directly leverage any perceived military advantage. Think about that dynamic for a moment, and you can imagine how this kind of multipolar stability issue might play out. Maybe Beijing starts by looking at Washington DC and its allies as its primary military competitor, meaning they then go about starting the process of modernising and right-sizing their forces appropriately. We've seen China massively modernise their air force, integrate fifth-generation fighters, massively expand and modernise their navy, gain a carrier capability, expand the nuclear-powered submarine fleet. They built up their space-based assets, including missile warfare capabilities, enhanced their ground-based air and missile defences, and significantly, started to massively expand their nuclear force. It's clear from space that China is in the process of constructing hundreds of additional ICBM silos, and the country is generally assessed to have the fastest growing warhead count of any of the nuclear powers. Particularly when you're talking about the nuclear dimension, from a Chinese perspective, that might be what's necessary to make for stable deterrence. The US has a very large, very advanced nuclear arsenal, and a lot of ways to deliver those nuclear weapons with relatively little warning. Reportedly very noisy, older generation Chinese ballistic missile submarines might have been considered vulnerable to being hunted down by the US Navy. The older, smaller Chinese ICBM fleet of the late 90s or early 2000s might have been considered potentially vulnerable to an American counterforce first strike, with MIRVed American missiles destroying the few systems capable of reaching the continental United States, potentially in their silos. And so by building out their nuclear force to be closer to the American one in scale, Chinese decision makers might feel they can more reliably deter even the United States. The issue with the multipolarity problem, though, is that just because you build up weapon systems with a particular opponent in mind, there's no magic rule saying you can only use them against that power. A China with more and better missiles, more and better nukes, better warning systems, better defense systems, might be getting into a more even position relative to the United States, but in the process, it also builds up a greater potential advantage relative to weaker potential opponents like India. That in turn creates an incentive on India to invest the resources necessary to acquire at least the level of capability required to reliably deter an ever more powerful China. For example, to better protect the country's nuclear deterrent against an ever more capable Chinese nuclear and conventional force, India has moved closer and closer towards having a continuous at-sea nuclear deterrent. Over time, that's likely to give New Delhi greater confidence that they're going to have a survivable second strike nuclear option, even against a Chinese first strike. But from a Pakistani perspective, the same type of systems and capabilities that might be considered balancing when you compare India to China might significantly shift the India-Pakistan balance significantly in India's favour. Seemingly with an eye on China, India's ballistic missile and space capabilities have also been rapidly improving. I say presumably with an eye on China because India has apparently invested a lot in obtaining ballistic missiles with the kind of ranges that would be massive overkill for hitting literally any target in Pakistan, but coincidentally would be in the Goldilocks zone if you wanted to arrange express shipping to Beijing. Improved space-based assets would also give India a better view of what the posture of Chinese forces is at any given time, and potentially enhance their warning in the case of an escalation with China. But what might be deterrence-level capabilities with a view to China might be potentially superiority-level capabilities when compared to Pakistan. There is no realistic world in which you can conduct a counterforce first strike against China using the small Indian fleet of MIRV ballistic missiles. But if you're Pakistan, that same exact missile force might make you very, very nervous. And make no mistake, the issue is in no way limited to nuclear weapons. When Indian analysts look at the threat profile of things like China's J-20s, J-35s, and its air-to-air missiles like PL-15 and beyond, there is often a perceived imperative to build up the Indian Air Force in response. Maybe you get newer fighters like Rafale, maybe you get longer-ranged air-to-air missiles like Meteor. But when the missile's told to launch, it's not going to query whether it's being fired at a Chinese J-10 or a Pakistani J-10, which in turn is a pretty strong imperative for Pakistan to have those PL-15s of its own. I could go through a laundry list of comparative capabilities, but by now you probably get the picture. Just about anything China does to shift the military balance between itself and the United States is also going to shift the balance between China and India. And just about anything India does to try and redress the balance between India and China is going to affect the India-Pakistan balance. And as Chinese capabilities continue to grow to be partially matched by India, Pakistan risks being impacted by the ripples of an arms race that, at the top level, may not even really be about them, putting them in a position where they might have a couple of thoroughly imperfect options. Option one might be to simply accept the vulnerability, the new balance that's being created. But for a variety of hopefully very obvious political, military and social reasons, the first bloke in Islamabad to suggest the, hey guys, how about we just allow the Indians to become much, much more militarily powerful than us plan, may not find themselves going through a window in the Russian tradition, but they're probably not getting invited to many more meetings. The second traditional options for smaller nations in this position is to put themselves under another country's protection. The most famous modern example here would probably be NATO, or most of the countries in the broader US alliance structure. That might then allow Pakistan to invest less in keeping up with a larger and more powerful India, but the risks and drawbacks would also be there. It would introduce the factor of a much greater reliance on the allied military power, assuming one is willing to take on that kind of relationship in the first place. And in Pakistan's case specifically, it would be difficult given the country's economic and geopolitical position. And from an economic perspective, while China provides the largest single share of Pakistani imports, far more of the country's exports and positive trade balances, and thus by extension its foreign currency reserves, come from selling Pakistani goods to the likes of the United States, the United Kingdom, and the European Union. In 2023, for example, the United States purchased considerably more Pakistani goods than China, as did just the combination of Germany and Italy, to say nothing of the rest of the EU. In other words, it's not entirely Pakistan's choice as to whether or not the external protection option is even available to it. And if it were, it likely wouldn't be one without trade-offs. The final option then, and perhaps the one most attractive to military leaders, is going to be to try and keep up with it all. You scale Pakistani military capabilities to keep pace with Indian ones and preserve the bilateral military balance. The core point here is that containing arms races and maintaining strategic stability is immensely difficult. Containing arms races and maintaining strategic stability in a multipolar scenario is even more difficult. And the risk is always, if there are incompatible views of what the relative military balance would be, that they have a tendency to create an arms race. One that, all else being equal, is likely to be lost by the country least capable of affording it. And if your comparators in this scenario are the likes of India, China and the United States, Pakistan's not exactly going to top the list for the amount of spare money they have to burn. Indeed, this is a country where, relatively recently, just the interest payments on the government's existing debts was taking up close to 60% of total government revenues. That's a pretty heavy handicap to play with if you're looking down the barrel of another potential arms race. And that leads in well, I think, to Pakistan's second core strategic problem: its economic resources compared to its strategic goals. Pakistan has taken something like 20 loans from the International Monetary Fund since 1958. The most recent one was approved against the backdrop of some difficult economic conditions in September 2024. And from a military and strategic point of view specifically, Pakistan's key problem isn't just that the economy has definitely had some rough spots. It's that over the long term, it's been significantly outperformed by its main strategic rival, India, meaning that over time, a lot of the key metrics that can underpin a country's potential military power have shifted more and more in New Delhi's favour. If you look at GDP per capita in nominal US dollar terms, back in 1993, Pakistan actually had a significant advantage over India. By 2013, India had gained the lead, until in 2023, Indian GDP per capita was now more than 2/3 higher than in Pakistan. Combine that with the significant asymmetry in population between the two parties, and you can probably imagine what the total GDP chart looks like. In 1993, India's nominal GDP was just over 5 times Pakistan's. Although at $279 billion for India and $52 billion for Pakistan, these were still two relatively poor countries. Pakistan kept the ratio relatively tight out to 2003, but by 2013, India now had a 7.2 to 1 advantage, and the raw numerical value of the gap was now $1.6 trillion US dollars. Going by World Bank figures, the next decade then blew the ratio out to more than 10 to 1. The Pakistani economy by that point was, in nominal terms, 6.5 times larger than it had been 3 decades prior. But the Indian economy had grown close to 13 times over. Of course, defence economics goes a lot deeper than just a straight GDP comparison. The size of an economy obviously matters, but so too does its composition, and how much of that economy can be dedicated towards the military. And once again there, Pakistan had a historical advantage, which has significantly narrowed. In 1993, at the time on this chart when the gap between the two economies was at its smallest, Pakistan also had its most significant lead in the share of the economy that was being dedicated to the armed forces. Islamabad was north of 6% at a time when India was south of 3%, giving in percentage terms Pakistan a more than 2 to 1 advantage. By 2003 though, defence spending as a share of GDP had decreased slightly in India, but significantly shrunk in Pakistan. It wasn't 6.4 to 2.8 anymore, it was 4.1 to 2.7. The gap, in percentage point terms, had more than halved. By 2013, it actually halved again, now 3.1 for Pakistan and 2.5 for India, a gap of only 0.6 percentage points. A trend which continued out to 2023, with Pakistan dropping to 2.8% and India 2.4%, a gap of only 0.4 percentage points, at a time where the Indian economy was now more than 10 times larger than Pakistan's. Bolt those two indicators together and you have a situation where very roughly India goes from having a 2.3, 2.4 to 1 spending advantage in 1993 to a more than 9 to 1 defence spending advantage in 2023. And we're not yet done compounding the strategic challenges for Islamabad on the defence economic side. If we're comparing states in this way, we don't just care about the size of their economies or the share of it they spend on defence, we care about their capacity to potentially ramp up that spending. Some reports out of Pakistan, for example, indicate the government might be considering an 18% increase. But across different countries, there are a range of factors that can go into determining just how realistic it is to hike defence spending significantly and in a sustained fashion. If they really try to ramp up, there's a chance that Pakistan might struggle with several of them. For one thing, the fiscal position of the Pakistani government has long been challenging. If you're a relatively wealthy economy that can borrow comparatively cheaply and invest with good rates of return, or you're the United States and can simply print the global reserve currency to pay your debts, a 90% debt to GDP ratio might be drawing a couple of disapproving glances, but no one's going for the fire alarm. But there is a reason that Pakistan has had to go to the IMF again and again and again. At time of recording, the yield on a German 10-year government bond is just over 2%. For America, it's just over 4%, India 6%, and for Pakistan, north of 12%. Meaning, in terms of the total interest repayment burden, if Pakistan had 50% of GDP financed at those levels, it would feel roughly like Germany sitting at something like 250% debt to GDP. This goes to the core of why, in some recent years, the Pakistani government has come close to 60% of government revenues being directed straight into interest repayments on existing debt. By global standards, sure, the debt puddle doesn't look particularly deep, but with interest rates like these, even a puddle can pose a drowning risk for a country like this one. Part of the IMF agreement to try and resolve the situation beyond just the IMF bailout was a requirement that Pakistan take several reform steps, that they privatise some state-owned assets, ramp up taxation, and cut down spending in a number of areas. But tax hikes and spending cuts are never going to be popular at the best of times, and in a lower middle income country like Pakistan, where for a lot of the population a very significant share of their income can go to purchasing just the basics, it can also be a political and social stability issue, as we've seen with previous protests in Pakistan over things like increasing electricity and petrol prices. The core point is that, leaving aside the raw size of the economy for a moment, the Pakistani government has long been in a challenging fiscal position. It has a lot of debt, a lot of very expensive debt, a lot of promises made to the IMF, and a lot of imperatives to keep people happy at home. In that context, the kind of trade-offs that almost always come with increased military spending are going to be all the more acute. And to keep the defence economics hat planted on my head for the moment, it's not just about the ratio. From Pakistan's perspective, the absolute scale of the resource gap also matters. At very low resource levels, the way these countries were for much of the Cold War, as the total amounts of money and resource available grow, it's possible for the larger power to start hitting breakpoints, if you like, starting to achieve economies of scale, or hit the point where it might make sense to invest in capital equipment to speed up and lower the cost of production. There are also some capabilities where you can only ever scale down the costs so much, and so in order to realistically access them at all, you need to be able to make a certain level of investment. Think about it this way. If you had 50 grand, you could absolutely buy a car. If you had 500 grand to spend, you could either buy a very, very fancy car, or you could buy more cars. But unless it's being delivered straight from a Western Sydney car park, you probably couldn't buy any level of car for $500. You're just below the purchase breakpoint, and that same logic applies to military systems as well. From aircraft carriers to space-based assets, there are certain niche capabilities, certain nice-to-haves, that Pakistan can probably expect India to accumulate in the coming years and decades. Capabilities where matching them on anything like a one-to-one basis would probably impose some very ugly trade-offs on the Pakistani military and the country's economy. A final area of defence economics related concern that might bear mentioning is increased reliance on a small number of arms suppliers. Pakistan does have an established capability to domestically produce some types of ordnance and military equipment. A number of its major arms purchases have involved technology transfer and a degree of local manufacture. But at the same time, Pakistan is a long way from being able to produce everything its military needs domestically. And that means if it's realistically going to try and compete with countries like India, it needs access to imported systems. There's a bit of a meme out there, sometimes popular on the big screen, that arms dealers are always happy to sell to both sides. Whether or not that's ever true on the black market, however, at a nation-to-nation level, these relationships are often more long-lasting and strategic. You can end up with situations where both countries operate equipment from the same country. Both Pakistan and India fly Mirages, for example, but often there'll be pressure, if you have a major market relationship with one side of a potential conflict, not to go selling those same capabilities to the other. India has spent and continues to spend big on the international arms market, engaging with a number of suppliers. Pakistan, meanwhile, has become significantly reliant on China, which, to be sure, has given the country access to a range of military equipment and technology. And depending on what systems the People's Republic of China ultimately authorises for transfer, potentially including fifth-generation fighters, that relationship might be key to modernising and building up the strength of Pakistani forces going forward. The risk worth flagging, though, from a first principles perspective, is the more reliant a buyer is on a single or small group of sellers, the greater potential leverage the seller might have, either to shape the commercial terms of those transfers in their favour, or to use those transfers as a source of leverage to shape policy responses in other areas. Whether that ultimately becomes an issue for Islamabad or not, only time will tell. But given the focus we've seen this year on countries not becoming over-reliant on single international sources for their weapon systems, I thought it was a dynamic and a potential risk that deserved a mention. So where then does that leave us in conclusion, presuming of course that current events don't result in an escalation spiral? I think the broad evaluation is that in the here and now, while the Pakistani military doesn't have the assets necessary to match the Indian armed forces, tank for tank, jet for jet, ship for ship, or submarine for submarine, it's acquired a mixture of conventional and nuclear capabilities that collectively have significant deterrence value. Its equipment inventory isn't universally modern by any stretch, but it does have some sharp edges. And once we have more and better verified information about recent events, we might be in a better position to evaluate how some of that equipment has performed. Assuming the recent escalation can be de-escalated though, I'd argue that from a defence economics perspective, some of Pakistan's greater challenges might actually be in the long term, where the question becomes how to maintain independence and the strategic balance in the context of a potential multi-party arms race, where most of the other participants are likely to have access to far more resources. It's clear we're now operating in a security environment where the line between war and peace has become a lot more blurred. We've seen multiple cases of countries apparently being able to launch air, missile or drone attacks on each other's forces without triggering an all-out war. And in that kind of environment, there are understandable imperatives to have the kind of capabilities you might want in that kind of scenario. And if there is one way in which war never changes, it's that kind of preparation has never been cheap. Barring significant changes, which are obviously possible in the trajectories of the Indian and Pakistani economy, making that work is likely to require careful investment, discipline in determining priority areas and selecting key capabilities, and a carefully considered understanding of what's actually necessary in order to maintain strategic stability versus what are the kind of military nice-to-haves that the country ultimately can't afford. Over the longer term then, I suggest that for Pakistan, this might be much more of an economics challenge than it is a defence one. The current military balance favours India, but with forces this large, nuclear weapons on the table, and the international community obviously invested in making sure outcomes never go too far, the prospect of either side concluding that they could, for example, easily win a full-scale war seems extremely remote. If there is a pressing imperative for Pakistani leaders over the long term, though, it might be to try and find ways to get the foundation, if you will, right, resolving some of Pakistan's economic and social issues and building up the industrial base, so the resource gap doesn't continue to grow the way it has for the last couple of decades. How exactly decision makers in Islamabad choose to tackle that challenge, however, especially in the context of recent events, only time will tell. And okay, brief channel update to close out. I first started working on an episode on Pakistan back in 2024, around the same time the episode on India released. My intention had actually originally been to release this around August. What I hadn't been counting on was a series of kinetic actions between two nuclear powers that made it make sense to release this a little earlier. What I hope it ultimately does is provide some useful context, an outsider's view, just as I did with India, on Pakistan, its forces, and the defence economics challenges it faces. As for more recent events, as I said earlier, I'd like to give things a little bit longer so that I have the time to verify some of the footage, chase down leads, and try and make sure that if and when I go over it in detail, I can be a little bit more confident about the information I'm giving you than I could be if I went right now. Thank you as always for your understanding, your patience, and your ongoing engagement and support. And hopefully, when I see you all again next week, the channel update can mention a continuing ceasefire and not a renewal of hostilities. See you then.